truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, August 9th, 2024, the 1297th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and when you do, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. So I think I may have briefly mentioned yesterday that Donald Trump was giving a press conference at Mar-a-Lago. And after I put the show up, I went ahead and put on the press conference, and Trump stood there taking questions from reporters for over an hour. And as always, he just stood there taking questions, reacting however he thought was appropriate. and consistently laying out his vision in impromptu fashion, something that we haven't seen at any point from the fake president, the fake vice president, or the fake vice president's fake vice president. Every press conference Joe Biden had throughout his campaign and his fake presidency consisted of scripted and pre-approved questions from the reporters, scripted responses on note cards for Joe Biden, and a plan for which reporters would be called on and where in the room they were sitting. But Trump simply walked to the podium, took questions as he always does, and answered them as he always does. Fully in command of the issues, fully in command of his position on all the issues, consistent from appearance to appearance when discussing the issues. He also takes the questions seriously, and he's thoughtful enough that he can actually provide insight on where things are headed in his answers. Something that people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are absolutely incapable of doing. And that makes sense, because all of their positions are kind of the cumulative effect of a massive and never-ending web of lies. So whatever story they're trying to tell is going to be extremely complicated, totally convoluted, and often far too specific. So they're really only able to relay those concepts in one particular way. They've got to nail down all the specifics in order to remain consistent with that great web of lies. And because of that, it makes spontaneity almost impossible. It's like when the Trump deranged try to make anti-Trump memes. They're not funny because they're too detached from reality to be funny. They're never clever. They're never evoking some deeper truth. It's because they've got to maintain that web of lies, and within that, there's no humor. When you're cut off almost entirely from the truth, there aren't very many places to go. Now, we talked at the beginning of the week about how the media was trying to gin up controversy over Donald Trump's comments on Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. And it's great that Trump made those comments last weekend and that the media covered those comments, whether they did it on Trump's behalf or they did it because they were trying to defend the rhinos. There was a lot of talk this week down in Georgia about election fraud as the state elections board was meeting. Trump traveled down there for a rally speech. He made those remarks. And by the time the state elections board was meeting throughout the week, people were tuned in on Georgia. In fact, this week, the story about Harrison Deal made the rounds again, to the point where people who are far more mainstream than I am were sending it to me. Harrison Deal, by the way, was Brian Kemp's daughter's boyfriend, a staffer of former Senator Kelly Loeffler, who was reported to have lost her Senate runoff election in fraud-riddled Georgia on January 5th, 2021, and then the next day backed out of challenging the certification of the fake November 3rd, 2020 election. So Loeffler staffer, Brian Kemp's daughter's boyfriend, Harrison Deal, killed in his car during the conversation about whether or not Georgia would begin a forensic audit of its elections. And along those lines, you might recall when a man named Clint Hickman on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors had his chicken farm burnt down right as the forensic audit in Arizona was set to begin. But here's Donald Trump addressing the situation with Brian Kemp. The reporter asks him if he thinks it's possible to repair the relationship.
I don't know. I don't know if I can or not. I got him elected. Without me, he wouldn't be governor. I got him elected. He was doing terribly. I got him elected. With that being said, I hope we can repair it. But if we don't, the people are still the people, and they're going to vote. We're leading in Georgia by a lot. We're leading in Pennsylvania by a lot. So, but I don't know. Now, in Pennsylvania, I have great relationships. In Georgia, I do too, but unfortunately not with the governor. I've never understood it. When you get somebody elected, they're supposed to like you. He's not exactly, for some reason, and you'll have to ask him about that. Yeah, I'd love to see it get repaired. I think that if we don't win Georgia, Georgia is a big win, is a big state. So I won Alabama by a record. Nobody's ever gotten that many votes. I won South Carolina by a record. You don't win Alabama and South Carolina by records and lose Georgia. It doesn't happen. And the people of Georgia understand that. There was tremendous anxiety and problems in Georgia. A lot of people say, what happened? And we have to, all we want is honest elections. If we have honest elections in Georgia, and we have honest elections in Pennsylvania, we're going to win them by a lot.
And Trump, of course, is referring to the 2018 election cycle, where Brian Kemp was declared the winner rather than Stacey Abrams, who was supposed to win, and who then went on just continuing to pretend that she did win, accusing the Republicans of voter suppression, saying that's why she lost. She was actually robbed. Stacey Abrams, the human election fraud machine, had her election stolen from her. Apparently, it was a big surprise that Brian Kemp won. You have to wonder if maybe Brian Kemp knew he was supposed to lose and planned to lose. That was the deal. The deal was he would lose. And somehow that was thwarted by Trump. And things have never really operated just right in Georgia. And you'll remember that basically the same thing was happening in Florida with Ron DeSantis and Andrew Gillum. Was Gillum supposed to win and guide Florida through the very deadly pandemic? Was Ron DeSantis supposed to ride in on his white horse and save the day in the 2022 midterms? Let's put that whole COVID thing behind us. And then with that amazing momentum, Ron DeSantis riding that wave, then he would immediately run for president, becoming instantly the most popular Republican in the land, the anti-woke crusader, and surely the front runner for this here current presidential campaign. But I guess things went off track, and here we are in a totally different reality. What I just described is a conspiracy theory, and yes, it's a conspiracy theory that maps perfectly onto our reality, but it can't be true, no matter how much better things would have been for the Uniparty if that's how the situation's transpired. Everybody knows, or at least we're told by the Republican establishment, that elections in Florida and Georgia and Texas, of course, are all very free and fair, safe and secure, and the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the voter. Except, of course, that's not really true because there are rampant problems in all three states' elections. But again, that's not what we were told by the Republican establishment, who says it's their goal to win elections for Republicans. And of course, that would include Donald Trump. You'd think that these very patriotic Republican governors would be doing something about election fraud in their states. And hey, maybe something's going on behind the scenes. Maybe they really are fixing elections in their states. And we're still in the phase where they have to keep that a secret from absolutely everyone. And I'm okay if we keep playing that game for a little while longer. Maybe it's true. I can't rule it out completely. But it's strange, isn't it, that Governor Abbott, Governor Kemp, and Governor DeSantis never really mention the election fraud that happens in their states? It's like they're worried that it's going to affect their own legitimacy. And because the television says that we have to protect these brave, patriotic, new Republican superstars, everyone wants to focus on Democrats stealing elections in blue states. But let's focus on Florida for a second. Trump was asked a question by a reporter. The reporters aren't mic'd, so they're difficult to hear throughout the press conference. But she asked how Donald Trump himself, as a citizen, planned to vote on the right to abortion ballot measure in Florida. And let's take a second on this. This is ballotpedia.org. What would the initiative do? This is Florida Amendment 4, the Right to Abortion Initiative, to be decided on November 5th, the big election date. The initiative would provide a constitutional right to abortion before fetal viability or, quote, when necessary to protect the patient's health, as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. So as long as whoever is performing the abortion says this is going to help the patient's health, they can perform the abortion. That's what that means. People pretend that that's about a real doctor deciding that there is a life or death matter here and that an abortion is the only way to save the life of the mother. And that's the sort of instance bound to garner a lot of sympathy, and justifiably. but it's certainly not the only instance where this reasoning is used. The following language would be added to the state constitution. Except as provided in Article 10, Section 22, no law shall prohibit, penalize, delay, or restrict abortion before viability or when necessary to protect the patient's health as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. The initiative would not change the state legislature's authority to enact a law requiring the parents of a minor to be notified if their child is seeking an abortion, with exceptions that can be attained through a judicial waiver. There are other states, by the way, with ballot initiatives on abortion this fall, and they are Colorado, Maryland, New York, Nevada, and South Dakota. Now, as we've discussed many times, these abortion-related ballot measures are being used as a narrative device to suggest that there will be high Democrat turnout based on this abortion issue. That's why they've tried to make it a national issue. They've tried to assert that there's going to be some kind of abortion ban that Donald Trump will sign into law as president, despite Trump never at any point supporting a nationwide abortion ban. We've been told that the threat of a nationwide abortion ban drove turnout in prior elections in 2023 and in 2022, and that Democrats and independents turned out in red states like Kansas and Ohio to vote in favor of abortion. And apparently people actually believe that. I guess it's impossible to steal ballot measures. So Trump was asked how he would vote on that ballot initiative, how he personally would vote.
Go ahead.
Are you planning to vote on Florida's abortion referendum in November?
On what?
How are you planning to vote on Florida's abortion referendum this November?
Well, I'm going to announce that. I'm going to actually have a press conference on that at some point in the near future, so I don't want to tell you now. But Florida does have a vote coming up on that, and I think probably the vote will go in a little more liberal way than people thought. But I'll be announcing that at the appropriate time. Please.
So Trump says he's going to have a press conference in the near future about the right to abortion ballot measure down in Florida and how he's going to vote. I'm not sure if that will be part of the press conference. But then he says he thinks that the vote is going to go a little more liberal away than people thought, which I think we have to take to mean that the right to abortion ballot measure is on the verge of being approved in Florida under Florida's perfect election system. I mean, it must be a perfect system. Ron was up in the polls by 5 and he ended up winning by like 20. It was amazing. A huge victory. Ron DeSantis is America's governor. Right after that midterm, man, oh man, Ron DeSantis, political superstar, governor of Florida. Oh, what's that? He's already running for president. Well, I guess it makes sense. I mean, what a dominating win he had in Florida. It used to be a purple state, but now it's a deep red state because of Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis's policies are attracting so many people from out of state into Florida that it's more Republican than ever. And then not too long after that, Democrats won a mayoral race in Jacksonville. Florida just could not get any redder except in Jacksonville, where they decided that in the middle of Democrats just tearing the country apart with their race and gender nonsense, the vaccine mandates, then, of course, the immigration, the Ukraine war, and the rest of it, the good people of Jacksonville were like, no, we need to go Democrat, even in Ron DeSantis's Republican paradise down in Florida. Ron DeSantis won big, Brian Kemp won big, Greg Abbott won big. That proves that establishment Republicans are what we need. It proves that there are legitimate elections in Texas, Georgia, and Florida. Because if there weren't legitimate elections, then it would look really weird that the Republican establishment was singing the praises of Abbott, Kemp, and DeSantis for their big wins in a rigged system. But let's just assume that they really are this popular in these states. And to be clear, I have no doubt whatsoever that Texas, Georgia, and Florida are red states, insofar as that means anything. But if Florida's so red and so many Republicans have come to Florida and Florida's elections are legitimate, then how in the world is Florida about to pass a right to abortion through a ballot measure? I've talked about ballot measures many times. They were very popular in California. If you had enough money, then you could put together a big street team and have that street team go out and collect enough signatures to get virtually anything put on the ballot. And then you would pay a whole bunch more money to turn on the election fraud machine. And lo and behold, now you've got a law that everyone in California has to follow, and no one can be held accountable for the passage of that law. You want to get rid of that law? Good luck. Ballot measures, they're legal, and also they are super democratic. I mean, assuming the elections are legitimate and that they're free and fair and the reported results accurately reflect the will of the voter. But of course they're not. They're certainly not in California. Are they anywhere? Is there any reason to believe that they are anywhere? No, of course there's not. So what does it mean that these abortion-related ballot measures are passing in what we're told are red states? Well, that should indicate that elections in red states are rigged and stolen as well. And if Ron DeSantis is America's governor and all these Republicans have flooded to the state of Florida to bask in Ron's glory, how could it be that they're about to lose on a right to abortion ballot measure in Ron DeSantis' conservative paradise? It seems like maybe Florida's elections aren't so good. And again, hey, if something else is going on behind the scenes and Ron DeSantis is just playing his part perfectly, well then congratulations, Ron DeSantis, and I will owe you an apology for ever doubting you. But if that's not the situation, then Donald Trump is going to have a press conference to expose the fact that Florida is about to approve a right to abortion through a ballot measure, and the Republicans of the country can then think about exactly what that would mean. And if that happens, what is Ron DeSantis going to do about it? Is he going to kickstart an effort to get his Republican supermajority to do something about that legislatively? Or is he going to attest to the legitimacy of Florida's elections and say, well, I guess this is what the voters have chosen. Florida, where woke goes to die. Now, speaking of rigged and stolen elections, it was just last week that we were told the very brutal socialist and then eventually communist dictator Nicolas Maduro down in Venezuela had stolen their election. Maria Corina Machado, who had been barred from running and was instead just smuggled inside the skin suit of an older man, much like Kamala Harris and the fake president Joe Biden. She seemed to be the global regime's candidate of choice, and despite not running, she was essentially declared the winner in the person of Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia. And as we discussed on Monday, our own illegitimate State Department here eventually recognized him or her or them as the legitimate winner. Not that the rest of the world did, but apparently the State Department thought that it could overthrow Venezuela with good PR. And we talked about how Elon Musk weighed in. He seemed to be a big Maria Corina Machado fan, and he spread claims about Nicolas Maduro stealing the election far and wide, making sure that the whole world knew that something was amiss in Venezuela's elections. And all sorts of very based and red-pilled influencers immediately began sharing videos of riots in the street, basically Venezuela's BLM. But since Elon Musk said Maduro was trying to steal the election, it was all justified. No problem, let's just root for BLM for a little while. Well, over the course of the week, Elon Musk just kept trolling Nicolas Maduro, making it seem all rather comical. Elon called Maduro a donkey. He threatened to use his space lasers against Maduro. He changed Maduro's Twitter verification badge from the official government color of silver to the normal everyman color of light blue. They both eventually agreed to participate in some kind of fisticuffs. Elon said that if he was victorious, Maduro had to resign as president of Venezuela. And he offered that if Maduro was victorious, Elon would happily send him to Mars for free. Maduro called Elon Musk the archenemy, and it was all very contentious. and very funny. And a lot of people, rather than looking at the facts and trying to see what fits patterns that we understand are repetitive and therefore very likely true, people basically went with Maduro is a socialist dictator, according to the New York Times. And Elon Musk says Maduro is a donkey. Therefore, Maduro is a bad guy and Venezuela's BLM is good. And I get it. That whole series was very entertaining. And if people spazzing out helped make it all go viral and spark up the conversation, more power to that narrative op. Because the important thing is that what's happening down there gets people to understand the elements of election rigging and election theft and how those situations are handled after the fact in the country and by the so-called global community. And late yesterday, the story took an all-new turn. This is Reuters. Venezuela's Maduro blocks X access in country for 10 days. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on Thursday took tensions with social media platform X, formerly Twitter, and its owner Elon Musk to new heights, banning the platform in the South American country for 10 days amid furor over a disputed presidential election. Maduro said he signed a resolution presented by regulator Conatel, which, quote, has decided to take social network X, formerly known as Twitter, out of circulation for 10 days, end quote, and accused Musk of inciting hate, civil war, and death. X get out of Venezuela for 10 days, he said in a speech which was broadcast on state television. And as always, remember when you read state television that the state television outlet is being identified by state television. Reuters is as much global state regime propaganda media as you could possibly ever find. The global state media is identifying for you Venezuela's state media. Does it matter that the president of a nation is addressing that nation on state media? Could you imagine reading this sentence in a Reuters article if it was about the illegitimate American president and American state media? Could you imagine it saying, referring to Joe Biden, he said in a speech which was broadcast on state television? Why does it matter where it's broadcast? The president is speaking. They are attempting to discredit Maduro's statement by implying that only state media would carry comments like this. Also, if Maduro is a brutal communist dictator, why isn't he just banning X, formerly Twitter, permanently? Why is he doing it for 10 days? Maduro and Musk have frequently traded barbs over X, formerly Twitter, with the platform's owner comparing the Venezuelan president to a donkey, while Maduro has blamed Musk for being a driving force behind protests and dissent following the election. They have also offered and accepted challenges to fight each other in comments on X and via Venezuelan state television. The temporary ban on X, formerly Twitter, another swipe at big tech, after Maduro this week urged supporters to abandon Meta-owned WhatsApp in favor of Telegram or WeChat, saying the messaging app was being used to threaten the families of soldiers and police officers. And I gotta say, I think he's right there too. I abandoned WhatsApp in 2020, and I'm very happy that I did. The article goes through some of the backstory on the recent election, and it concludes this way. Countries including the U.S., Argentina, and Chile have refused to recognize Maduro's claimed victory, instead urging transparency and the publication of the voting tallies. China and Russia have congratulated Maduro on his victory. And yeah, go ahead, publish the voting tallies. Let's make that a thing where countries are expected to publish the voting tallies. Full information, transparent to everyone, or at least their own citizens. It's also noteworthy that Reuters didn't mention that the United States recognized Maduro's opponent as the legitimate winner. They only say that the U.S. has failed to recognize Maduro's win. Venezuelan security forces have launched a crackdown on what authorities say are violent criminals, with Maduro touting more than 2,000 arrests. Advocacy groups say those arrested are peaceful demonstrators being targeted for repression. And that is exactly what they'll say about BLM Antifa here in the United States if the regime decides to send them to the streets in the wake of our election. The voices of Venezuelan voters will not be silenced by repression, censorship, or disinformation. The world is watching. Brian A. Nichols, Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs for the U.S. State Department, said in a post on X. And that's just embarrassing. Watching this feckless and illegitimate regime talk tough with nothing to back it up, just words of empowerment and inspiration. Everything is just a social media PR campaign to these people. Now, we've talked many times this year about how these international elections can be seen as templates for what might happen here in America in this election cycle. In Ukraine, for instance, we had the comedic actor Volodymyr Zelensky banning opposition political parties, canceling the elections entirely because they're in the middle of a war, declaring martial law, and holding on to power. His term ended nearly 3 months ago. Why aren't the supporters of our democracy calling for immediate elections in Ukraine? We talked about the banning and marginalizing of Imran Khan's party in Pakistan and his imprisonment. We talked about how in India, Narendra Modi had won, but not by nearly as much as people expected his party to win. He would have a majority. He would remain prime minister, and all the attention would be focused on him as the figurehead, him at the top of the ticket, while ignoring the fact that down ballot, with virtually no explanation whatsoever, Modi's party failed to meet expectations by a long shot. And now we have Venezuela laying down all sorts of precedent, issues that will relate directly to our election and post-election period. Most of you probably recall that in 2020, we had the Transition Integrity Project, and then the famous article by Molly Ball in Time magazine talking about the war games and planning process that put together this massive effort to, quote unquote, fortify the election in that post-election period between the steal on November 3rd, 2020, and the fake inauguration on January 20th, 2021. They had all the plans to take to the streets and how they were going to handle that with the media in a narrative sense. We see that same part of the Color Revolution playbook playing out in Venezuela. We are seeing the leaders of world superpower nations disagree about who the legitimate president of Venezuela is. Our illegitimate State Department announced that it was Maduro's opponent, while Putin and Xi and some of the other BRICS leaders stick with Maduro. Who will serve as the president of Venezuela? It's going to be Maduro. It's ultimately going to be the one with the actual power behind him, with the actual allies who can actually do something. Yesterday, a new wrinkle was added. Venezuela is going to cut off communications via the X, formerly Twitter, platform. Now, Twitter is not a free speech platform. If Elon Musk is trying to make it a free speech platform, that's wonderful, but it's not one now. There's still heavy censorship, still plenty of shadow banning. The algorithm is heavily manipulated to preference certain characters and certain narratives. People like me are prevented from participating in the subscription model or the ad model. And there are plenty of people who lost their access to that platform in 2020 and still have not had that access restored. We know that the U.S. government and its regime partners, whether they be corporate or in finance or in other world governments, used Twitter as an information weapon to shape the events of the world. We've been led to believe at various times that their access to that was cut off. It certainly has not been cut off. You have to wonder if Maduro is suspending Venezuelan access to X, formerly Twitter, in an attempt to head off those info ops. But I don't know that for certain. He could be a very brutal dictator who is just trying to prevent the people of Venezuela from being able to communicate and get information. Or maybe he sincerely believes that Elon Musk is attempting to sow discord in Venezuela and provoke a civil war. Maybe Elon Musk is a bad guy. Maybe he's the sort of guy who would do that. I don't think he is. But we can't totally deny the possibility. Elon, by the way, is supposed to be interviewing Donald Trump in a Twitter Spaces session on Monday. And I guess that's going to break the internet if that's still what the kids are saying these days. But you never know. Either way, there's going to be 10 days without access to that social media platform in this post-election period. Is that a potential template for the future here in the United States? It could be. Will it be X, formerly Twitter, that has its access cut off? And if access is cut off, can you really prevent X, formerly Twitter, from being accessible? What if people have Starlink? Is the regime going to attempt to shut off access to Twitter and make people get their information from legacy social media platforms or from alternative social media platforms that haven't been built up, fortified, strengthened, popularized enough to adequately and quickly keep people informed? That could be their plan. I would hope that people have created a presence on some of the new alternative platforms and they've learned to use them so that none of these information channels are cut off. But what would happen if Twitter just dropped out of the picture for 10 days? There is a massive PR campaign that has spanned years now, designed to convince people that Twitter should be their go-to news source. Everything that's happening in the world, they can find out about on Twitter. Unless, of course, the people talking about those things are censored or the subjects themselves are censored. But everything besides that, people can find out about on Twitter. And as long as you prevent those other people from engaging in the conversation and bringing in that information that's not being included in the conversation, people sitting around the intellectual kids table on Twitter can pretend that that is the most serious and most important conversation being had in the country right now. They tell themselves that over and over and over again while patting themselves on the back and making quite a lot of money for pretending to have an extremely important conversation that just doesn't happen to be all that important or all that attached to reality. What would happen if all of those very important influencers on Twitter lost access to Twitter for 10 days? Would they be setting the tone of the conversation? No, they sure wouldn't. And that would certainly be an interesting shift. Now, I'm not a proponent of that. I don't want people's communication channels cut off at all. But we're seeing it happen in other parts of the world. We should at least assume that it might happen here. It could happen here. There are clearly parties who have a pretty obvious, if not explicitly declared, interest in shutting down or at least controlling the conversation over on X, formerly Twitter. And I don't want to spend a ton of time speculating on all the hypotheticals, but just think, what would it be like if Twitter was turned off for 10 days in the United States? What would it be like if all of the legacy social media apps were turned off for 10 days in the United States? YouTube, Facebook Meta, Instagram, WhatsApp, Google Search, Snapchat. How would things shift if people who commonly get their information from only those sources weren't getting information from those sources for 10 days? And then reverse it. What if those were the only apps available? What if X, formerly Twitter, was shut down for 10 days and all of the alternative social media apps were shut down for 10 days? Would we be able to properly guide ourselves and the community around us, our friends, our family, our neighbors, on only the information we could retrieve from those legacy and mainstream sources, fully committed to telling us what they want us to believe and getting us to respond accordingly? I think it's a valuable thought experiment, and I think it's a valuable conversation that we're going to have probably a few more times over the course of this next 90 days, considering that period that will inevitably follow. And it's always a good reminder to take responsibility, take a few minutes, and go fortify ourselves on other social media platforms. Go get a Truth Social account, a Getter account, a Telegram account, a Gab account, or scale up and get into the next generation decentralized social media apps on the Nostr protocol like Damus and Primal and other apps in that ecosystem. And it's not like this is unrealistic. It happened in early 2021. They shut down Parler. The censorship, the labeling, the misinformation, the banning, the shadow banning, all of it on the legacy social media platforms, that wasn't enough to stop information breaking into that central narrative bubble from outside. People were using alternative platforms, and so those alternative platforms had to be shut down. They went ahead and shut down Parler. Now, a lot of people thought that Parler was maybe some kind of honey trap operation or something. They were kind of in on it. They allowed themselves to be shut down. And I don't know whether that's true or not. But the point is, they had the ability to do that through Amazon Web Services, and they got it done. They've talked plenty about taking certain apps out of the App Store, TikTok in particular. Now, everyone's all hung up on TikTok being this Chinese spyware, and maybe there's an element of that there. But by the same token, all the legacy social media apps are Chinese spyware. Under the good twin, evil twin paradigm, there's no discernible difference between the global regime in China and the same global regime here in America or in the UK or anywhere else. If the TikTok Chinese spyware is serving the same interests as the Meta, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp censorship and manipulation here in the United States, or the Google, YouTube censorship and manipulation here in the United States, or Twitter's manipulation around the world, why is TikTok the bad guy? Because it's the one we can call Chinese? So we have the example of a social media platform being taken down in this country. We have plenty of threats to take social media apps down, or at least out of the App Store in this country. The TikTok regulations extend also to apps like Telegram. And now we're getting a bright, flashing neon sign warning from down in Venezuela about a potential shutoff for 2024's primary public conversation app. And obviously, we don't know that will happen, but it's worth being prepared. It's worth understanding other apps, finding the people you follow over on those apps. And I go back and forth on this, but it might even be worth investing in Starlink, because it's hard to imagine that if internet communications go down, that it would be Starlink taken down and not all the rest of it, since the point would be to broadly prevent access to information, not just do it in the little niche that uses Starlink. And it's also worth thinking about the overlap with the press release from CISA, talking about how the communication systems for election information might go down, but that doesn't mean that the voting process will be changed. It's just the communication of those votes. If you want to create chaos in the post-election period, making it difficult to communicate about public affairs in general and making it impossible to get election results at all, that's a pretty good way to cause chaos. Now, we talked about Venezuela as a template for all kinds of election fraud and various regime strategies in the post-election period, the color revolution playbook. Let's continue. This is Zero Hedge from today. President of voting machine giant Smartmatic indicted on $1 million bribery and money laundering charges. The founder and president of Smartmatic, the company whose voting machines and software are trusted, in quotes, around the world to provide secure elections, was indicted by a federal grand jury on Thursday, along with two other company officials, on charges involving a bribery and money laundering scheme used to secure elections contracts in the Philippines. Roger Pinate of Boca Raton, Florida, along with Jorge Miguel Vasquez, 62, of Davie, Florida, were among those charged over the alleged payment of $1 million in bribes to the former chairman of the Philippines Commission on Elections, Juan Andres Donato Bautista. These bribes were allegedly paid to obtain and retain business related to providing voting machines and election services for the 2016 Philippine elections, and to secure payments on the contracts, including the release of value-added tax payments, according to a press release from the U.S. Department of Justice. According to the indictment, the alleged co-conspirators financed the bribes by over-invoicing the cost per voting machine used in the elections. To hide their crime, prosecutors say they used coded language to refer to a slush fund used to make the illicit payments, causing the creation of fraudulent contracts and fake loan agreements to make the transfers appear legitimate. The defendants then allegedly laundered the funds related to the bribery scheme via a constellation of international bank accounts in Asia, Europe, and the United States, including in the Southern District of Florida. Bautista, Pinate, Vasquez, and Eli Moreno, a dual citizen of Venezuela and Israel, are each charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering and 3 counts of international laundering of monetary instruments. Moreno, you know that old Jewish Israeli name, Moreno? Ha! A dual citizen. I'm sure his primary citizenship is in Israel, or maybe that's just his backup citizenship in case anything bad happens and he has to escape somewhere. That Israeli right of return really comes in handy when you're doing something that the Zionist regime loves, but that the laws of the country you live in prevent. If convicted, Bautista, Pinate, Vasquez, and Moreno each face a maximum penalty of 20 years for each count of international laundering of monetary instruments and conspiracy to commit money laundering. That's from the Miami Herald. Smartmatic was founded in 2000 by Pinate, Antonio Mujica, and Alfredo Jose Anzola, making international headlines after Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez chose the company to replace the country's voting machines in 2004. In 2006, they acquired Sequoia Voting Systems, though later divested its stake. According to Smartmatic's website, Pinate, quote, played a critical role in planning and executing the world's largest election using optical scanners in the Philippines and in Smartmatic winning the largest election contract in U.S. history in Los Angeles. The company responded to the indictment Thursday night, saying in a statement, Smartmatic has learned that 2 of our employees have been indicted for alleged violations of the FCPA in the Philippines almost 10 years ago. Regardless of the veracity of the allegations, and while our accused employees remain innocent until proven guilty, we have placed both employees on leaves of absence effective immediately. No voter fraud has been alleged, and Smartmatic is not indicted. Voters worldwide must be assured that the elections they participate in are conducted with the utmost integrity and transparency. These are the values that Smartmatic lives by. And yes, we can see them living their values every day. Many have mentioned, and this article notes as well, Mark Malloch Brown is a British diplomat and former politician who has served in various high-profile roles, including Deputy Secretary General of the UN and Minister of State for Africa and the United Nations in the UK government. He became chairman of Smartmatic's holding company in 2014, a role that has drawn attention due to his friendship with George Soros and his involvement with the Open Society Foundations. Smartmatic is currently involved in a defamation lawsuit against Fox News over election rigging claims. There's also a member of the Atlantic Council on their board named Peter Neffinger. The Federalist's Sean Davis, who I consider a well-intentioned normie, posted this on X, formerly Twitter. As you digest the news of Smartmatic indictments, remember what kind of regime you currently live under in this country. Were top executives at Smartmatic, a voting machine company, indicted by the regime because of bribery and fraud? Or were they indicted because something that wasn't supposed to happen was allowed to happen? And that can't be allowed to happen. As J.P. Morgan once said, a man always has 2 reasons for what he does, a good one and the real one. When it comes to the regime running our country, I think it's always worth asking what the real reason is. And Davis links to a New York Times article with the headline, Election Results Presented by Venezuela's Opposition Suggest Maduro Lost Decisively. So he is making the proper connection, but in my mind, not properly contextualizing it. It seems pretty clear to me that we are getting this template for a reason. This is the reason. And now we are all the way back around on this 4-year-long, but I suppose truthfully much longer, just not as much in the public spotlight. But this 4-year-long conspiracy theory loop that is now getting closer and closer to closing. We were told that the machine stuff was a conspiracy theory, that there was no relation between these companies, Dominion, Hart, ES&S, Smartmatic. No link to George Soros or the Open Society Foundation or the global regime. Nothing in common between our elections here in the United States and those held in the Philippines and in Venezuela. Fact check after debunk after fact check told us that all of that was a conspiracy theory. There was nothing there whatsoever. And here we are with people in the mainstream accepting that, oh, actually, all of that was true. And they're paying attention due to this obvious, to me, info op playing out in Venezuela. Another foreign election laying down a perfect template for what we can expect to see here, as well as a perfect opportunity to expose the problems in our own elections based on the problems we see in other countries' elections. Just amazing that that's happening, and what spectacular timing. You could not have planned it any better. This Zero Hedge article really does a great job of compiling a bunch of information. They add this post from a user over on X, formerly Twitter, from the Lou Dobbs show on CNN back in 2006.
And his partner Alfredo Anzola received a small business loan from the Venezuelan government only months before the recall election. These corporate registration documents from Venezuela show the Venezuelan government owned 28% of the stock of another company they started, Bizta, which adapted voting software for the Smartmatic machines in the 2004 elections. The same document shows a Chavez government minister, Omar Montillo, was on the board of directors. The Chavez government gave Bizta, Smartmatic, and another company a $91 million contract to run voting machines for the 2004 election. The next year, the owners of Smartmatic, primarily owned by Venezuelan businessmen, bought Sequoia, one of the top electronic voting system companies in the United States, for $16 million. Smartmatic is a labyrinth of international holding companies owned by Venezuelan businessmen. Smartmatic Group NV of Curacao, Netherlands, Antilles owns Smartmatic International BV of Amsterdam, Netherlands, owns Smartmatic Corporation of Florida, which bought Sequoia Voting Systems of California, USA. When Smartmatic bought the U.S. voting machine companies, the U.S. government did not review the sale. Many experts say those voting machines were manipulated in Venezuela to give President Hugo Chavez a victory. Exit polls done by the U.S. firm Penn, Schoen and Berland had Chavez losing 41% to 59%. But the next day, Chavez declared victory, reversing the score, saying he won 59% of the vote.
Everything was computed in the favor of the government. So the only explanation is that the Smartmatic machines had been programmed in that way.
A Harvard mathematician crunched the numbers on the Venezuelan election.
It had to be the Smartmatic system. All these machines talk to a central computer and report on their results. And in that mechanism, as they communicate with the central machine can report anything.
Smartmatic is technically based in Boca Raton, Florida, but the president of the company, Jack Blaine, testified to the Chicago City Council. Fewer than a dozen Smartmatic employees work in Florida. The majority of the workers are based in Venezuela.
It's amazing, isn't it, how something could be known for so long and then become a conspiracy theory, only to eventually become known again. My good friend John Harold, founder of Badlands Media, also known as Patel Patriot, posted about this Smartmatic story on X, formerly Twitter, recalling article number 5 in his Devolution series where he discussed Smartmatic. He wrote in his post on X, formerly Twitter, the president of Smartmatic was just indicted for bribery and fraud. Smartmatic is a member of CISA's EISCC, along with companies like Dominion Voting Systems and Runbeck Election Services, to name a few. Members of the EISCC are private sector companies who are the owners and operators with, quote, significant business or operating interests in U.S. election infrastructure, systems, or services. The mission of the EISCC is to, quote, advance the physical security, cybersecurity, and emergency preparedness of the nation's election infrastructure, end quote. Members of the EISCC operate under the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council framework established by the Secretary of Homeland Security, which allows them to operate without oversight. Our government actually signs a waiver allowing these companies to be on the EISCC because they recognize there is a, quote, potential for a conflict of interest, end quote, for members of the EISCC. They justify allowing this because their, quote, service outweighs the potential for a conflict of interest created by the financial interest involved. The EISCC was one of the groups who released the November 12, 2020 statement saying, quote, the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. John says this should disturb you. I agree with that. He also notes that our elections are fake and links to the Devolution series part 5 in particular. And by all means, go ahead and take a look at that. And let's conclude our week of discussions on foreign elections, election interference, propaganda, censorship, and this ever-evolving shit show with NBC News. Iran is targeting the U.S. election with fake news sites and cyber operations, research says. And it is absolutely critical to note here that this article is by Brandy Zadrozny, who is NBC's and MSNBC's resident conspiracy theory hunting shitlib. Iran is stepping up its influence campaign aimed at the U.S. Researchers at Microsoft said in a new report, adding to the ongoing efforts by Russia and China to sway American public opinion before the presidential election. And Microsoft has just been crushing it, just absolutely knocking it out of the park lately. You can trust them. If there's anyone you can trust, it's Microsoft. Wait, is Microsoft the MS in MSNBC? Oh, yeah, they are. Or at least they were. They have divested their business since then. The MSNBC brand was just too strong to ever think about changing the name. Researchers identified websites that they attributed to the Iranian operation, aimed at voters on the political left and right. One website, Neo Thinker, bills itself as, quote, your go-to destination for insightful, progressive news and analysis that challenges the status quo, end quote, and hosts articles that bash former President Donald Trump and hail Vice President Kamala Harris as, quote, our unexpected, awkward savior, end quote. Another site identified by researchers, Savannah Time, poses as a voicey, conservative, local alt-weekly. We're opinionated, we're noisy, and we have a good time. The About section of the site says it hosts articles claiming to be written by, quote, the spokeswoman for the International League for Women's Rights, end quote, arguing for more modest Olympic beach volleyball bathing suits next to articles lauding Iran's military might. The Microsoft Threat Analysis Center noted the sites were likely using artificial intelligence tools to lift content from legitimate U.S. news publications and repackage articles in a way that hides the content source. The group behind the sites, according to Microsoft, is part of a larger Iranian operation active since 2020 that operates more than a dozen other fake news sites targeting English, French, Spanish, and Arabic-speaking audiences. The campaign has not found significant success with a U.S. audience, and the site's content has not been shared widely on social media, according to the researchers. But researchers say the sites could be used closer to the election. Can you believe it? The Iranians have created this vast web of conspiratorial fake news websites that no one visits, and that the conspiracy theory hunter for MSNBC is now currently publicizing, even though no one's ever heard of these sites. It's almost like someone made these sites up to link them to Iran and is then just laundering that hoax through NBC's Brandy Zadrozny to make it sound like an actual threat to our election systems while she advertises that those sites are somehow real. Beyond the effort to sow controversy and divide Americans before the vote, researchers said another group linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targeted a, quote, high-ranking official on a presidential campaign, end quote, in June, with a spear phishing email from a compromised email account of a former senior advisor and attempted to access an account belonging to a, quote, former presidential candidate, end quote. Is that Joe Biden? The report did not name the people who had been targeted. Iran's United Nations mission did not immediately respond to a request for comment, but denied reports of meddling in a statement to the Associated Press. Iran has been the victim of numerous offensive cyber operations targeting its infrastructure, public service centers, and industries. Iran's cyber capabilities are defensive and proportionate to the threats it faces. Iran has neither the intention nor plans to launch cyber attacks. The U.S. presidential election is an internal matter in which Iran does not interfere. Always worth mentioning and remembering, by the way, that Chris Krebs of CISA, Chris Wray of the FBI, and John Ratcliffe, Donald Trump's director of national intelligence at the time, gave a press conference just before the 2020 election, alleging foreign interference in that election by Iran and Russia, accusing Iranian actors of accessing voter databases online to send threatening emails to potential Democrat voters in a pro-Trump effort. So does Iran interfere? Maybe. This doesn't seem to be a very good example of that, though. She writes, Microsoft's report also noted continued activity by Russia, including an operation by a group researchers call Storm 1516, which produces propaganda videos in support of Trump and Russian interests and distributes them through a network of fake news websites connected to a former U.S. police officer. China-linked actors, the report said, had also pivoted increasingly to spreading propaganda via video and had leveraged a network of online accounts to stoke outrage around pro-Palestinian university protests. The researchers reported an expectation that Iran, along with China and Russia, would intensify cyber attacks against candidates and institutions and increase efforts to divide Americans with propaganda and disinformation in the run-up to the election. And obviously, over the course of the past few weeks and few months, there's been a pretty broad effort by media to sell the idea that Iran is a threat to the Middle East. They're a threat, most particularly to Israel. They're a threat to the world. In fact, they were thinking of assassinating Donald Trump, didn't have anything to do with the Trump assassination event, but they still want to do it. And here they are interfering in our election. And of course, they're trying to go to war with Israel. We were told that Iran was going to attack Israel in response for some assassinations over the weekend. And then we were told it's going to be Monday or Tuesday. And then we were told it's going to be Thursday. And it still hasn't happened yet. It's very strange. I mean, they're going to attack Israel, right? We were told they wanted revenge. They're going to do it. Maybe. Probably. Maybe not. CNN published this article yesterday. Iran mulls scrapping plans to take revenge on Israel in exchange for a Gaza ceasefire. Well, that's something that was already going to happen. That was already in the works. We were told that was going to happen prior to the assassinations, and then the assassinations were going to cause an escalation in the war. From the article in CNN, Iran needs diplomatic cover to back away from its hasty threats against Israel in the immediate aftermath of Hania's killing. A Gaza ceasefire that would allow Tehran to claim it cares more for the lives of Palestinians in the Palestinian enclave than it does for taking revenge would fit the bill. But the payoff needs to be big enough for Iran, as its honor and deterrence are at stake. So again, they're just doing PR. This CNN article is suggesting potential narratives that might work. A couple paragraphs later, referring to the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian's response suggests he is listening. A quote here: "If America and Western countries really want to prevent war and insecurity in the region, to prove this claim, they should immediately stop selling arms and supporting the Zionist regime and force this regime to stop the genocide and attacks on Gaza and accept a ceasefire." And that seems reasonable, but it's also quite bold, calling out the Zionist regime. So they haven't gotten their war all week, and now it sounds like they might not get their war. Are we getting World War III this time or not? Here is former Bill Clinton White House Chief of Staff, former Obama CIA Director, and former Obama Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta on CNN today with Wolf Blitzer, figuring out if maybe there's still some way to squeeze a war out of this situation.
You were the U.S. Defense Secretary. You know the region well. You know the issues very, very closely. How would you be handling what's going on right now if you were still the Defense Secretary? And I ask the question specifically because Israel is now a member of the U.S. military's Central Command, which is in charge of the whole Middle East, as opposed to when you were Defense Secretary as part of the European Command. What does that suggest to you about the potential difference?
Well, what it means is that there's a larger direct focus on Israel and on Israel's enemies. And that means that the United States plays a much more important role in terms of trying to defend Israel. And that's as it should be. The issue then becomes if, in fact, Iran or the proxies decide to conduct a massive attack in which a lot of innocent Israelis are killed, it leaves the United States very little option but to go in and help defend Israel in that kind of war.
Not just with military equipment, but with troops as well? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you know, you'd like to believe that we could provide the military capabilities as we have been in order to be able to ensure that Israel can do the fighting and do the fighting effectively. I think we'll try to exhaust that option. But when you're in an escalated war, everything is on the table.
They've been telling us to expect war for quite a while, but it doesn't seem like Iran wants war. Doesn't seem like anyone wants war except for the global regime, and they keep begging for it publicly and attempting to give us rationalizations for why a war against Iran by the United States would be justified. We're going to put American soldiers on the ground to fight Iran because Israel is our ally, no matter how much they escalate the situation. The paragliding go-kart incident is still just an excuse for whatever may come. What are these people talking about? Absolutely none of it makes sense, which I guess would explain their desire to shut off communications. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!